The Skeleton Tree, Chapter 7.
The Airplane.
In my hand the sticks leap and bounce on the drum top. Boom, 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 boom. I have kept the fog away, and I don't mind if it stays where it is. A whole fleet of ships could be hidden inside it, plowing towards me right now. At any moment they might appear, dragging tendrils of mist from their funnels and masts. But I can't let the fog come closer. I beat harder and faster on that drum, sending the sound rolling across the sea like little pearls of thunder. Boom, 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 boom. In my mind, I keep seeing Frank at the fishing pool, bashing at the water. More than 6 weeks since that day on the river. I can still see the expression on his face as he grew more and more frustrated. It made me sad to watch him. It made me think of my father, who loved to go fishing as a boy, but for some reason gave it up. "Did your dad ever take you fishing?" I asked Frank. He didn't know what I had been thinking. He frowned for a moment and then said,
"Sure, all the time. We went fishing and hunting and everything. I wish he was still here now. He'd catch a pile of fish. He'd catch them with his bare hands."
"Not my dad," I said, laughing. Somehow, even that made Frank angry. He stabbed the gaff into the pool and swore as he slashed it through the water. "Let me try," I said.
"I can do better than you,"
he told me. "Then give me that jigging thing," I said.
"You'll lose it."
"Oh, come on," I told him. "How am I going to lose it?" But I lost it. The stones by the pool were slick with salmon blood, and I slipped as I cast out the line. The rusted old bolt flew from my hands. Frank heard it hit the water. He looked at the little splash out on the pool, and then at me, and then very slowly he stood up. I was afraid he would beat me with the gaff, just the way he had bashed the salmon. "I'm sorry," I said.
"That was our only hook. Do you have any idea?"
Frank held up his hands. The veins in his neck looked like tightened ropes.
"If we don't eat, we'll die."
"I know that," I told him. "I said I'm sorry." He stepped so close that I could smell seaweed and sweat on his clothes. I stared back at him, frightened, but he only reached out and ripped a loop of wire from around my neck, then walked away. He brought out the knife that I'd found at the stream and gutted the fish he'd caught. He tied the red wire in a loop through the gaping cheeks of the salmon and hoisted the fish to his shoulder.
"Let's go home,"
he said. Home? I didn't like to think of that tiny cabin as home. My home was in Vancouver, and I wanted so badly to be there. Frank's silence felt worse than ever as we walked along. I wished he would talk, if only to tell me how stupid I had been. I wished he would shout, but he didn't say a single word all the way to the cabin. And then he walked right past it, down the trail to the sandy beach. "Where are you going?" I asked.
"We'll eat on the beach," he said.
"Like a picnic?" He grunted.
"Yeah, Chrissy, like a picnic."
Well, it was no picnic. We ate seaweed that had just washed ashore, still salty and wet and gritty with sand. Frank used a knife to hack slabs from the salmon carcass, and we wolfed them down like cavemen. With blood and juice pouring over our hands and our wrists, we spat out the bones. It was cold and awful, but I didn't want to disappoint Frank. "It's like sushi," I said. He looked at me, but said nothing. "You know what my dad used to say about sushi?" I asked. "When I was a kid, we called it bait." A little glimmer came into Frank's eyes. He was careful not to smile, not to show emotion. He just nodded, as though at an old joke. But that encouraged me to keep talking. "My dad died a year ago," I said. "He was killed in an accident." Frank's expression didn't change. He looked down the beach, out at the rows of breakers. "He was an accountant," I said. "Then, so what does your dad do?" Frank shrugged.
"Not much."
I wiped my fingers in the sand. "Like what?"
"He lies around and decomposes."
It took me a moment to realize what that meant, and then it seemed a terrible way to put it. "I'm sorry," I said.
"Why?"
Frank leaned back on his elbows.
"Was it your fault?"
I gave up on the pleasant conversation. I watched the waves and thought of my father, remembering strange little things one after the other. When he came home from work, he would fling open the door and hold up his hand and say, "Greetings, Earthlings," in a funny voice. When he went away on trips, he would always bring back a present for me, but he would pretend that he hadn't until he looked into his briefcase with a clown's look of surprise. "Oh, what do we have in here?" he would say. The memory suddenly dissolved when Frank spoke again.
"There's that raven,"
he said. I saw a shadow flitter across the sand. Then the bird swooped behind us with a whistling sound in his wings. He landed on a log nearby, ruffled his feathers, and strutted back and forth. "Hello," I said. The raven scraped his black beak across the wood. "Want some fish?" I picked up the piece of the carcass, but Frank showed at me.
"No, don't give him that."
"It's just a tail," I said. "We're not going to eat it."
"If you feed that thing, you'll never get rid of it."
"I don't want to get rid of him." The fish tail dangled from my hand, all speckled and bright. As it swung from my fingers, the raven watched, his head swinging comically.
"He'll be a pest,"
said Frank. "Not to me." I tossed the tail into the sand just below where the raven stood. He made a little warbling sound and watched suspiciously, but he didn't move until Frank got up and walked away. Then he hopped down and grabbed the salmon, and in the same motion flapped away into the sky. As I watched him circle in front of me, a little speck of light appeared above the sea. I heard a rumbling sound, faint and far away. I stood up. "An airplane!" I shouted. "Frank, there's an airplane!" He was already looking at the sky, his hands like a visor on his forehead.
"Where's it at?"
he cried. The sound grew louder. I saw the dot of light again, already bigger. "There!" I pointed. "Right there!" Frank dashed away along the sand, heading for the cabin. I hurried after him in my clumsy, floppy shoes, and by the time I reached the cabin, he had been in and out already. He stood by the door, holding the little flare gun. He shook it at me.
"Where's the flare?"
he shrieked. "In the box," I told him.
"Well, it's gone."
The faint rubble had become a throbbing that I could feel in the air. I went past Frank and into the cabin. He had hurled the orange box into the fire circle where it lay with its lid cracked in two.
"Find the flare!"
yelled Frank. The jet was very close. Frank blundered through the room like a trapped bird, bouncing from wall to wall. He knocked over a table, he toppled a chair, and then he grabbed the signaling mirror from the ashes and barreled outside. I ran after him down the trail towards the skeleton tree. When we reached the clearing, the jet was nearly overhead. I saw the wings and fuselage glaring in the sunlight, a contrail streaming out across the sky. I waved at the plane. I jumped up and down and shouted, "Do you think they can see us?" I asked.
"They're 5 miles up, you moron,"
said Frank. He was aiming the mirror toward the plane, sighting through the clear round spot in the middle. He was trying to reflect the sun into the tiny windows 5 miles away as he tilted the mirror this way and that. But the jet was already gone. It was moving across the clearing, above the skeleton tree, on towards forests and the mountains. "Could they see the mirror?" I asked. "Frank, do you think?"
"How would I know?"
he snapped.
"Don't be stupid."
It felt strange to stand there and watch the airplane fly away, to think of the people inside of it. I tried to imagine someone leaping from a window seat shouting, "There's someone in trouble down there! You gotta believe me!" But that didn't seem very likely. The plane became a dot again and slowly faded away. The contrail began to break apart, turning red in the high sunset. Seeing it vanish made me feel at the edge of the world in a different way. All the normal things were still going on, and would go on no matter what happened to Frank and me. There were 7 billion people on Earth, and all but a handful were living their lives unchanged, without a thought or care for us. Frank looked so slumped and sad that I felt sorry for him. "It might come again," I said. "Maybe there's a schedule."
"Yeah, once a century,"
said Frank. We went together down the trail, together to the cabin. Frank stepped right over all the things from the orange box and collapsed on the bed. He rolled himself up from the foam pad, using it as both a blanket and a mattress. "I thought we were taking turns with the bed," I said.
"We are,"
he said.
"When it's your turn, I'll tell you."
I jammed the door shut, as I had the night before. I stuffed everything back in the plastic box except for the flare, which I couldn't find, and the space blanket, which I hoped would keep me warm. With the cabin guy's spoon, I scraped 2 marks in the wall to show that we had lived 2 days in the cabin. I wondered how many days would have to pass before I'd cover the whole cabin with notches. I imagined myself again as a bearded old man gouging the last possible mark in a far corner, trying to remember what I was counting. Frank watched from the bed but didn't say anything. I put the spoon on the table, opened the pouch, and pulled out the space blanket. It looked and felt like a shiny garbage bag, just one thin layer of plastic that crackled as I spread it out. Disappointed, I pulled it over my feet and legs and up to my chin, and hurled myself in the corner. I wasn't as cold as I'd been the night before, but I sure wasn't toasty. I shivered as I tried to sleep, and even that annoyed Frank.
"Stop crinkling," he told me.
I slept off and on till dawn, when a shadow flittered past the slits of light in the cabin wall. Something tapped at the window. I couldn't see anything between the nailed-up boards. The thing scratched at the plastic pane. As loud as I dared, I whispered for Frank. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again. "Frank!" He sputtered in his sleep, but didn't wake up. I whispered again, and the thing outside began to talk. It muttered words I couldn't understand. Its voice wasn't human, or at least not alive. Through the window came a crackling hiss like an old man's breathing. Lousy birds. I didn't care if Frank got angry. I scrambled out of the blanket and shook him awake. "Frank!" I shouted. "Frank!" He woke up with a gasp and then pushed me away.
"Leave me alone," he said.
"Something's trying to get in," I told him.
"Oh, Chris."
"Just listen," I said. He lay back, glaring up at me. I saw his eyes shifting as he looked up across the ceiling and down towards the floor.
"I don't hear anything," he said.
"Well, it's there," I told him. "It was pulling at the window. It was—" Frank shoved me aside as he got up. He crossed the cabin, pushed open the door, and stepped out. I held my breath, expecting that thing to come charging from the forest, but whatever had been there was gone. Frank walked around the little cabin, and when he came back I felt about 2 feet tall, a frightened little kid. He looked at me as though I was a bug. "It was there," I told him. "I heard it, Frank. It talked to me." He flicked his hair.
"What did it say?" "Lousy birds."
He laughed. He sat on the bed and put on his boots and shook his head and laughed again.
"You really are a moron. Now come on, let's go."
"Where?" I asked.
"To the river."
He picked up the gaff, put the knife in his pocket.
"We have to go every day. We have to get at least 100 fish."
100, I said. "Why?"
"You want to run out of food in the middle of winter?"
He walked out of the cabin and away through the forest, leaving me staring at the open door. "What do you mean?" I shouted, but he didn't answer. I pulled on my stupid shoes and ran after him, yelling at his back. "We're not going to be here that long." He didn't even slow down. He just held up his hand to make a rude gesture. "Someone will come and find us," I said. My voice was swallowed up by those huge trees and the blankets of moss. I ran to catch up with Frank and tugged at his arm. "You don't really think we'll be here all winter, do you?"
"How should I know?"
He pulled away from me.
"But the salmon won't be here."
I hadn't thought of that, but Frank was right. When the last salmon in the pool had made its way over the falls, there would be no more till summer came again. Along the cliffs, then along the beach, I trailed a few yards behind Frank. He stopped near the reepicheep to cut a coil of rope from a big snarl among the logs. He went straight to the pool and started fishing. There were even more salmon than before, their dark backs rising from the water as they swam against the current. In less than a minute, Frank had one laid out on the rocks.
"Come here," said Frank. "I'll show you how to clean them."
I was happy that he talked to me, and I knelt beside him to watch how he did it. First he slit the salmon's belly. Then he cut away the guts and the heart and the liver all at once. He tossed them into the pool, and the seagulls pounced in a shrieking mass. Frank rinsed the whole fish in the pool, and the blood and the scales floated away through his fingers.
"Think you can do that?"
He asked. "I guess so." We kept fishing all morning. Frank hauled in one fish after another, and soon we had 7 laid out in a row. Frank guessed they weighed nearly 100 pounds altogether. We threaded ropes through their gills and tied them in bunches and then walked back, bent like old prospectors. When we reached the cabin, Frank didn't rest. He cut every fish in half, down the spine, making slabs of red flesh and shimmering skin. He hung them from the ceiling. "How do you know how to do this?" I asked. "I guess your great dad taught you."
"Sure, he taught me everything,"
said Frank. He used bits of wire to hang the fish, threading the pieces through the scales and skin.
"They'll dry hard, like candy. You don't need a fire."
That was Frank's way of saying that he had given up on building a fire. He had tried it and failed, and would never try again. But the strange thing was that he actually believed himself. In his mind, he could still build a fire if he really wanted to. It just wasn't worth the trouble. I couldn't imagine that the salmon would dry like candy, and by the end of the day they were starting to smell, but I didn't complain and I didn't argue. I was afraid that if I made Frank angry he would leave, that I would wake in the morning and find the cabin empty. I slept out of the table that night, as far as I could get from the door and the window. It was another ruthless night spent waiting for morning, with the wild singing of wolves in the distance. To see dawn come gleaming through the little cracks made me frightened instead of happy. But the thing did not come to tap at the window again. Night after night, as I added marks to the wall, it was the thought of that thing that kept me awake. Waiting for it to come scratching around the cabin was nearly as bad as hearing its voice. I kept myself busy and I made myself useful so that Frank would stay around. I collected bottles and filled them with water at the stream. I scraped out a pit to be a bathroom, and then made a toilet by bashing a hole in the seat of a plastic chair that I had dragged from the beach. I even found a little box to hold our roll of toilet paper. I had gathered buckets of berries, the sour salal, and the hard little huckleberries. Frank didn't thank me. He just dragged me into his schemes, his big plans that never worked out.
"We'll make an X in the clearing,"
he said on our third morning.
"We'll make it so big that they can see it from the space station."
We trudged up and down from the beach, dragging long chains of junk like old Jacob Marley's ghost. We collected everything that was red and we laid it out in the clearing. Frank stooped down and sighted along the stick to make sure our lines were straight. But on the first windy night, our X became scattered sprawl of plastic bits. In a little fit, Frank kicked half the stuff back into the sea, and we never rebuilt the X.
"We'll build a raft and sail away."
That was his second plan on the 7th day. He dreamed it up as the sun went down, and spent the whole night planning a great raft 40 feet long. In the morning he sent me off to gather fishing floats, barrels, and buckets. He took the knife and started slashing at the tangled rope and fishing nets. For a while I thought it might work. We had a small forest of logs, and more rope than we needed, and no end of things that floated. But every night the tide reached higher up the beach and stole our floats, or the waves bashed our bundles into pieces. When Frank saw a smashed barrel tumbling in the morning surf, he looked frightened. I was sure he was somehow reliving our landing in Uncle Jack's red boat. I actually saw him tremble before he noticed me watching.
"What are you looking at, moron?"
he said. That same day he stopped work on the raft and never started again. My notches on the wall spread towards the corner. Each marked another day of fishing at the pool, hanging up salmon to dry, of arguing with Frank. Not one day was really happy, and one of the worst of all came on the morning when I went behind the bush we called our bathroom and discovered that Frank had used the last piece of toilet paper. Not even the cardboard tube was left. Not even the plastic bag. I had to squat with a fistful of leaves, and I felt like an animal. How we hated each other. I couldn't stand Frank's hair flicking, his pouting, his little laugh that made me feel so small. He tried to make me angry, refusing to talk about his life in the city or my Uncle Jack. I sometimes thought he argued just to pass the time. He got mad when I made mistakes, when I put something down in the wrong place, when I didn't answer fast enough. Sometimes he called me such awful names that I felt like crying. Frank still had the bed and the foam pad. It was the worst bed I'd ever seen, but I could hardly stand the thought that I had to sleep beside it on the floor. I had to look up at him while he looked down at me, and as long as he owned the bed, he was in charge. If I wanted things to change, I would have to fight him for it, and I doubted I would win. He was too big and strong. On my half of the cabin, I got the rickety table. On my half, I got the fish. Another 6 or 7 every day. They hung mostly on my side. I had to duck and weave to get around them. The only thing we shared were the flies. They filled the cabin as thick as raindrops, from tiny whining things to giant deer flies that could take a chunk out of a person's flesh. They buzzed at my arms, at my neck, and my hair. I decided that flies were most horrible things in Alaska, not counting Frank. On our 13th day at the cabin, the Raven came back. I was sitting at sunset on the rocky point, hoping for a ship to come along when I heard the peculiar whistle of his wings. I turned around to see him settling at the top of the skeleton tree, above the smallest coffin. He folded his wings and made a little croaking sound that I imagined was Raven's way of saying hello. Hunched as he was, he looked sad and lonesome, and I wondered if he had come to visit the body of his dead friend. I remembered wandering through the cemetery after my father died, thinking that I was going to visit him there. I hoped the Raven remembered his friend soaring through the sky, not hanging from a doorway wrapped in red wire. From the top of the tree he called again, his voice now a musical note like the sound of a wooden xylophone. Of all the sounds he made, it was the most beautiful. I wondered if he had always perched in that same tree at the setting of the sun to sing that little song. Maybe he liked to keep company with the skeletons or to watch over the old bones. But what if he came on stormy nights, when the moon shone through ragged clouds, and he roused the skeletons from their coffins? What if he assembled their bones with his black beak and drove them down into the tree to run through the forest? It was such a gruesome picture that it made me shiver, and then I laughed at my own imagination. But as I looked at the Raven perched above the silvery coffins, a strange little phrase popped into my head: the black fruit of the skeleton tree.